Right. Now, for our second session today, it's my pleasure to invite Julia Gorham and Paul Cutrone from Seyfarth, and they'll be talking about future world of work. Julia and Paul, can I ask you to turn your webcam on? Hi, Paul.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, Julia. Right. Quick introduction. Paul Cutrone is a partner in the International Labour, Employment and Safety Practice of Seyfarth in Australia, and assists clients to identify, manage, and respond to their health and safety risks. Paul works with clients in a wide range of industries, and his expertise extends to supply chain management, including transport safety, modern slavery, and environmental legal risk management. And Julia is a partner in the International Employment Law Practice of Seyfarth and is based in Hong Kong. She helps companies make decisions that are right for them by bringing a pragmatic and textured understanding of the legal, regulatory compliance, and governance environment in which they operate. She has in-house experience as counsel for a US investment bank in APAC, as well as numerous in-house secondments. Julia gained her experience in leading private practice firms, both in EMEA and in APAC. So welcome, Julia and Paul. And please, you can start sharing your screen and take this presentation.
Let's see if this goes better than it did last time. So hi, everyone. It's great to be here talking to everyone, although it's much nicer to see people in person and get that sort of vibe off the audience. As Rahul mentioned, we're going to be talking to you about some of the employment law and health and safety aspects of future working environments. And off the back of that, we actually had a recent seminar that we hosted for clients with a work futurist called Ross Dawson. There's a QR code at the end of the presentation, and you can scan that and you can share that with your teams, and you can look at that separately. Ross talks about the future of work from a much more work futurist, macro and sort of societal build perspective. So a very, very nice introduction to future work environments. What we're going to focus on today is a little bit more of the legal and the kind of practical aspects of that. Dumbing it down for the lawyers in the group who are not futurists. We're going to look at some of the key trends that we've all faced over the last couple of years. We're going to look at what's coming, certainly in terms of new workplaces and what our employees expect from work going forward. We're going to look at some of the challenges for leadership and how leadership styles may need to pivot coming into the future, and sort of how you can get yourself set up for success in that area. And then Paul's going to cover off some of the occupational health and safety aspects of working in the current pandemic and sort of moving forward. So this is one of my favorite quotes that I came across as I've been sort of doing research for this. I don't know how many people on this call are sick of Zoom. I know we're on a Zoom, so here we go. But one of the things that people have talked about in terms of the polarization of work is, some people are in the back to the office camp, some are in the I want to work for remotely forever camp, and then there's a pile of people sitting in the middle. One of the key arguments that some companies are using to try and effectively force people back into the office or sort of encourage them back in is this concept of collaboration, that we need to continue to drive work culture. We need to have people face to face so that we can get that collaboration, continuing it builds our corporate cultures. But actually, a lot of studies have shown, and Derek Thompson wrote a great article in The Atlantic showing that a lot of collaboration time has been wasted. You sit in meetings, you sit on Zoom calls, a lot gets talked about, but not a huge amount gets done. And actually what we're saying is, if you took away 20% of those meetings that were ineffective collaboration time and you put it back into output, you might avoid what he calls the eternal purgatory of circling and circling back, which I'm sure resonates for all of us. A couple of words that you're going to hear throughout this talk are decentralized workplaces. So the work futurists are quite often now, instead of talking about remote working, they're talking about decentralized or dissipated work models. We're going to talk about flexibility, of course, the F word. We're going to talk about empowerment and engagement. So, I'm going to go back one actually. Rahul, could you put up the first slide, because that was cheating, the first poll for me. So on your screens, you will have our first poll, which is just a set of questions. And I want you to pick the top 3 trends that you think are shaping your business in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, interesting. So in a minute, I'm going to show you the poll that we did on these questions for EMEA and the USA, which will give you some counterpoint data, and we can get you this data. Obviously, it's like a slightly Asia-Pac focus, but that's quite interesting. So actually, in terms of the poll responses that we had from other groups, you guys are absolutely on track in terms of the top bucket. So greater use and advance of technology and automation, I think, is pretty clearly going to be a good one, and is going to be really important in terms of both the employee experience, but also in terms of optimizing your workforce and getting it to be effective in terms of particularly those of you in the supply chain and driving efficiency, but also dealing with some of the macroeconomic and political issues that you may face in delivering your work. Going down, interestingly, D and I is relatively low on this scale, so I would put that slightly higher, but cybersecurity and cyberterrorism, yeah, we have seen more and more clients being impacted by cybersecurity. We had a client with a nasty breach earlier this year where an employee clicked on the email and responded as if it was a real person, and sadly 30 seconds of I guess due diligence would have stopped that person making the mistake they did that cost the company millions. So I think we can close that one, Rahul. So actually, this is the poll question for the next poll. So you can see this one in advance. This was actually the poll question that we asked for EMEA and the USA in terms of a separate set of questions. And you can see here that actually navigating the remote and hybrid work scenario was actually the most important issue. That's no big surprise in terms of where we are all working at the moment. I think most of the big companies have now really got to grips with what that looks like in the immediate term, but many are grappling with how do we wrestle back some control as an organization in terms of what we want that to look like versus what the employee expectation is now that many people have worked remotely and may not want to come back to the office. So that is absolutely, I think, number one. Availability of workers, we've seen a huge shortfall in workers, in EMEA and the US particularly suffering with that. We're seeing some of it in Asia, but I think that will actually increase over the next few months. And this is going to be tied up with something that I'm going to come on and talk about shortly. Company culture, you'd expect there, and health and safety fair is what Paul's going to come on and talk about. And health and safety in this space, particularly with COVID, comes in a variety of different ways. It's people feeling insecure coming into a workplace or commuting, as well as the opposite, which is, what if I'm fully vaccinated and I've had all the tests and I want to be in the office, but other people are refusing to vaccinate and they may be putting myself at risk and then me passing it on to other people. So, those questions are still there. There's also a huge amount about the mandating of vaccines, which is a hot topic in the US, which is now informing quite a lot of the corporate decisions that are being made in the region. Asia historically has not gone down the mandating route, but we are seeing increasing amounts of companies taking that approach, or at least taking a vaccinate or test approach. So with the survey that we did in EMEA and the US on that last set of questions, out of those respondees, 42% said that their organizations will allow significant numbers of staff to work fully remotely by 2024. So that's a pretty big number in terms of the overall full remote work system. We are generally seeing, Paul and I have seen more clients looking at the sort of hybrid model and maybe looking at a 2 to 3 days in the workplace approach. But, this is quite an interesting statistic that this will vary hugely in Asia, I believe, because the nature of our workplaces is very different. The nature of our business is different, but also the nature of our housing situation is so different. It can be hugely less palatable in Asia to work in a small apartment than it is if you had a house and a garden, for example. But actually, out of this poll set of data, 39% said they will have less than 70% of their staff on premises at one time. So again, that's also a relatively high number. If you're thinking about, you're going to have in that metric, you're going to have at least a third of the workforce out at any given point in time. That then feeds into some of the decisions that you as organizations can make around your building strategy, your footprint, but also how you manage the legal implications for your employees. So if you have a third of the workforce working remotely at any given point in time, what do you do in terms of making that a formal agreement with your employees? Do you want it to be formal? Do you want that to be a flexible arrangement? What we do think is that employees have found, in many cases, that the hybrid remote working type scenario gives them more control of what we call their marginal time. So in the office, your marginal time might be taking a break from your computer screen. You walk out, you go and get a coffee. Not super helpful to the rest of your life. When you're working remotely and you have your marginal time, you go and unload the washing machine, you take the dog out for a walk, you check your kids' homework, whatever it may be. A lot of people find that much more helpful for their lifestyles because it then spares their actual personal time for more fun things. So that has been a real sea change for a lot of people. And there are a lot of employees who don't want to give that up. So in terms of structuring how you engage with your employees going forward, it's thinking about, what is the impact on how they've been working over the last 2 years that they are not going to want to lose? And can we build that in to the structure that we're going to apply on a going forward basis? In terms of productivity, actually, a lot of the studies have shown that productivity is at par, if not better, in some sectors. Certainly, the white collar sectors have, legitimately, it's pretty easy for us to work from wherever, as long as we've got a phone and some internet and a laptop. That's very hard to justify. Sort of forcing people back into the office full time, although I know a lot of companies have taken that approach for very, very good independent reasons. But it is one of those explanations that employers are going to have to get to grips with, which is, explaining why that doesn't work for your particular business. We do think that there's a huge amount of work to be done in terms of assessing what is this work, what is the work that's getting done, focusing on the output and the type of work that your employees are doing. It will be different by different categories, rather than focusing on where that work is getting done. And that sometimes takes a bit of introspection and sort of deep thinking by us as managers to actually elucidate what we're really talking about. When we're talking about remote and what we'll call now decentralized and hybrid working, there are myriad legal and practical issues that come with these different systems. In terms of the legal issues from an employment law perspective, what we do know is that people have to now consider what is the structure that we're looking at. Are we going to look at a hub and spoke model for employing our employees? Are we going to have a few central offices and then people farmed out from those different sites? Are we going to start using service companies back again? And particularly in Asia, that used to be sort of how we went at sort of in the early 2000s. Service companies were quite big business and they sort of fell out of vogue. We do foresee some of that coming back as a centralized way of employing people, even if they're not working in a centralized environment. Will people be using primary offices? Yes. Some companies have come out very clearly, the Goldman Sachs of the world and those people, of saying, actually, we want a primary office model. That works for them. Some companies are going down the third space route, which means, potentially using co-working spaces, potentially incubation spaces where you have complementary businesses sharing the same space for cross-pollination. So looking at the actual structure you're going to employ will have different legal ramifications depending where your employees are going to be based. In the decentralized model, one of the key issues there that comes up, or issues, it's just a factor of it, is what we call asynchronistic working. So synchronistic working is I sit in my office as I'm doing now. It's very exciting to be back. And I do my work, ideally between 9 and 5. That would be nice. And everything is synchronized. I'm in front of my computer and I'm working. Asynchronistic work is kind of what we've been doing over the pandemic with remote working on Zoom, not necessarily having my hours set between 9 and 6. I can choose if I get up at 7 and do 3 hours of conference calls, I can then take a break. At 9 in the morning, go to gym. That's asynchronistic working. It means that I choose when I can complete my tasks. Some companies confuse that type of working with remote working. And actually, they're two different concepts, because you can have people working remotely, as in not in the office, but on a synchronized basis, which means companies who require you to be online from 9 at your computer, even though you're working remotely. And some of those companies have very strict check-in methodologies. So those are very, very different sort of approaches. When we look at some of the other legal issues, many of you will have struggled with people working overseas for short periods or rather the long periods. We do have to think about tax issues at that point. Do they bring your particular business onshore for a PE tax risk? So that's for your corporate folks, your permanent establishment corporate tax risk. If you have employees working in a different country, in theory, can bring your business into that offshore jurisdiction for tax. Likewise, there will be income tax and social security thresholds that get hit when employees are working overseas in a different country for a number of days or weeks. There are ways to structure those. Some people have used secondments and sabbaticals to help there. Some people are requiring very, very short periods if they are allowing overseas working altogether. Of course, you need to look at immigration considerations if you're looking at overseas work. We do also have to think about regulatory requirements, because if you have licensed employees in your business, they may need some sort of grandfathering of their license into a new jurisdiction, or some sort of exemption from the current regulators, whether it's Hong Kong or Singapore, for example, to be providing their services from overseas. So that is one factor we need to think about. Paul will come on to talk about the health and safety aspects. Data privacy, I'll put confidential information at MMPI. We know that this is a big risk has been a big risk of sort of the remote decentralized working issue, and sort of making sure your security controls are really up to scratch, and people using VPNs and not using public Wi-Fi at home, making sure that their desk spaces are clear and they're not leaving papers and sort of laptop screens open, because that is now a key business risk for all of the sort of companies operating in this space. I think the practical aspects of this are actually more interesting, in that the whole COVID debate has basically transformed the workplace. It sort of moved the debate forward about 10 years quicker than it was ever going to go organically. So the idea of workplace transformation is not going back in the bottle. It's here to stay, and it will now accelerate. Communication, collaboration, again, I've talked about the fact that it tends to be used as a bit of a panacea to describe why people need to be in the office, but I think we all need to challenge ourselves about whether that's accurate. There has been a lot of data showing that use of Zoom and sort of media platforms during the pandemic has brought distinct teams closer together, because people are making more effort to reach out to their immediate colleagues and their immediate teams. So you huddle, you get on, you have one-on-one. But what it has done is it's broken some of the wider networking that you might get in an office situation. So where someone may come in and meet people from different teams or different aspects of the business, that's much harder to do if you're sitting at home, because you may not get the introduction in quite the same way. So trying to find ways to break down some of those barriers if you are going to be keeping that sort of hybrid working, or moving to a fully remote situation. We do need to look at changing the way we measure output and performance. As I said, productivity actually generally has been pretty high. We certainly haven't seen a huge amount of issues with, in the legal sector, people sort of billing 1 hour a day when they were billing, 12. It's actually been much more stable. People are sort of being more respectful about their time and sort of actually enjoying the ability to work flexibly and sort of making sure that they are measured accordingly. Go back. That's my screen. One of the things we need to know here is that there has historically been a measurement that is quite optical. It's been about a little bit about FaceTime and being in the office. That's the slightly old school methodology of performance management. And I think we need to really adjust our performance metrics to really look at output. People who are producers tend to do better with the home working because there's a measurable output. It's very hard to measure someone's output when they are, for example, an administrator or support functions. That doesn't mean they're not being successful and sort of producing the right output. But how our metrics measure don't necessarily match up with how we can record that in the new environment. Blurred lines. I think everyone has talked about the erosion of boundaries with remote working, and that has become problematic in many ways. It can lead to extremely long working hours. You log on at 7 a.m. and you're still sitting there at 10 o'clock at night. Hopefully you take your asynchronistic work break and pop out in the middle of the day. Not everyone. And it is much easier when you've got a work office set up at home to sit down at the weekend and do the work that needs to be done. I think that the psychological impact also of having your workstation in your house can also mean that people are psychologically not switching off because they know it's there. So this is definitely a managerial area where we need to put some control around and encourage people to make sure that they're logging off at certain points of day and not being expected to continue working just because they can. the sort of Zoom fatigue is a real one, as I mentioned before. Zoom burnout is a real thing. I spoke to a friend the other day in professional services who did 11 hours of Zoom calls back to back, and she was broken. She couldn't speak the next day. That's not necessary. We never used to do that in the past. You would never have been on phone calls for 11 hours a day. There's actually no reason why every communication has to be a Zoom call. It's helpful, obviously, in terms of interaction, but we need to choose when we use them, give people a break. And if they're not giving themselves that break, you as a manager can make that decision and sort of force them into it a bit. Burnout, Paul will talk about a little bit more in detail. Obviously, there's definitely a waning resilience in pockets, and people seem to go through waves in the course of the year. It's very hard to see those burnout areas unless you have a situation where people are willing to talk to you. So as a manager, encouraging people to communicate and be really honest about where they are. We've seen some great, certainly on LinkedIn, some great honesty coming from senior members of organizations where they are saying, I'm struggling, or I have developed alcoholism and I'm over it and I'm working and I'm productive now. But that level of honesty and tone from the top can be very useful to encourage other people within the organization to share. Unintended consequences. I just want to touch on this briefly before I move on. Unintended consequences here, where I'm going with this is that some people who have been working remotely, or who may be required to work remotely if your company is taking quite a tough stance on that, not giving people the option to come into the office, there can be friction in terms of relationships. A lot of people, living cheek by jowl with kids at home, small spaces, if you're looking at something like Hong Kong and Singapore. In pockets, there has been concern about domestic abuse increasing because individuals are not getting out of the house in the same way, and so they are not getting that visibility from external parties and who can pick up sort of those problems. Home costs can increase, obviously, with people being in the environment, and their electricity bills go up, with the internet bills go up. So, some of those are factors that are going to be important. Those of you who manage teams, certainly who are going into winter, will find that with the energy costs as they are rising globally, that is going to be something I think we need to think about as organizations going forward. How do we help support people whose cost base is about to go up quite significantly? One final thing I want to mention before we move on is there is one of the fears that we hear from managers about the hybrid working environment is, well, my team has not been concentrating during the pandemic. I'm on a Zoom call and the cat walks across the computer, the kid comes in. That's not what we're talking about in terms of structuring a long-term remote or hybrid working arrangement. Even before the pandemic, before we started down this path, remote working was a thing. And it was very, very clear throughout HR received practice that if you were working remotely from home or flexibly, that did not mean you were doing childcare. Okay. Oh, emergency pieces here and there. Yes, absolutely. But it was not it was not the sort of the purpose of you working remotely. And I don't think organizations will tolerate that on a going forward basis. So once the pandemic phase is over, there are going to be conversations to be had. That means if you are working remotely or on a hybrid basis, while you are working, we expect you to have childcare, pet care arrangements in place, so that you are able to concentrate on what you are employed to do. So, that's just one of those things that management can get a little bit more comfortable about, that people will be aware of those changes. Powershift is one of the key themes to come out of the pandemic. The move from organizational power to individual power. We see employees looking for empowerment all over the place. We see them looking for engagement in a different way. They have taken much greater control over their working lives while working in their own spaces. And that has given them, in many cases, the autonomy and the flexibility that they were craving and not getting in a traditional workplace. We don't see this as changing anytime soon. And this is actually, driving what I'm going to come on and talk about next, which is talent and the Great Resignation. So the Great Resignation, fact or fiction? In my view, it's absolute fact. We see a huge rise in attrition rates across, actually globally. It is higher in some areas than in others. In supply chain areas, it can be very, very high, and that was a lot driven by health and safety concerns. In the sort of more white collar area, that has been driven by just changes in a desire for purpose. How employers have handled the COVID situation has caused people to vote with their feet. People are more likely to leave a job without another job at this point because they feel that it's an employee's market and that there will be jobs available. So it's a hugely difficult time for employers. The war for talent has raged in the US, particularly, and certainly in Europe. I think we're a little bit behind in Asia, but it is coming. One of the things that we look at when we're looking at talent and how organizations are sort of setting themselves up for success in terms of the war on talent is how are they going about it? Recently, certainly in the legal profession, we've seen a war on associate pay. Certainly started in the US, and like pay rates went up and everyone panicked. But generally, received wisdom is that money doesn't do it in itself. It may help immediately, but it's a very, very short-term fix. It has an immediate impact, but it dissipates very, very quickly. What does help is buying in employees into the wider organization. If they feel engaged and empowered and valued as part of a team and they believe in where they're going, then they are more likely to stay and you are more likely to get full benefit out of their talent. The other things that have pushed towards the resignation is, people have very different sources of stress during COVID. A lot of people have financial pressure, worries about family, worries about healthcare, relationship issues. And if those things are not recognized by their employers or people are not sensitive to them, a lot of employees think that they can go to a company that is much more understanding or sort of alive to those different issues. So I think that where we get to here is the element of flexibility and autonomy that we have seen over the last 2 years, or the optics of that, or the experience of that for some employees, has really meant that employees are looking for a sense of choice that gives them self-determination and a way that they can choose their work experience. A good example of that would be if I have to draft or prepare a presentation, can I just choose to do that at home because it's easier for me to concentrate? I don't have people walking into my office. Or is my boss requiring me to be at my desk 9 till 6? Which slightly it takes the control out of that. And it means that I'm not necessarily very happy about how I want to work in the office today. Those things can cause people to feel infantilized and have that loss of control. In terms of the supply chain, we obviously, those of you who do have, particularly in the retail sector and other sort of, blue collar, blue chip environments where the supply chain is under pressure, there has been a shortage of labor, as we saw from the earlier poll. And what that means is in terms of the next phase of your recruitment retention programs going forward and your workplace transformations is how do we plug that gap? Part of this has been an under-resourced focus on employees in this sector. People tend to focus on their higher paid workers in terms of, how do we buy those people in? In this part of the employee experience, we now need to look at companies using technology to improve this as a work environment. So using technology to optimize supply chain, retail delivery, to remove some of the menial tasks that employees don't want to do, but also allow staff to have a better experience and less boring tasks effectively, and that does lead to a better retention rate. It also helps you manage your cost base because you've got less turnover and you've got less absenteeism, which is driven by people who are generally unhappy at work. So, and one of the key areas here is using technology in the right way can allow you to optimize your workflow across the year. If you're data driven, it can allow you to set up your work schedule so you know when you're going to need your staff in different pockets, and it allows you to then schedule their time off so that you know that you can give those people 2-week holiday, which they've been asking for, because you've actually thought ahead and gone, actually, I know in July we're going to be dead. I can let those people go with a 60% workforce, and we'll manage okay. Our supply chain won't be impacted. Interestingly, there was a study done in the US recently, and the outcome of that was that 73% of blue-collar workers surveyed said that they would rather give away $1 pay rises on their pay packet in favor of a more flexible work schedule, and that's the blue-collar sector. So again, flexibility, I'm going to hit that one over the head. It doesn't work for everyone, but you've got to challenge yourself about whether there are ways to make flexibility part of your business model going forward. So what are the drivers of the Great Resignation? Well, I've touched on some of them. huge amounts of the drivers behind this are purpose and empowerment. I've talked about engagement and motivation. There's a Harvard business study that talks about, it reviews and surveys Facebook's employees. And it's super interesting. You can find it on the internet. If not, email me and I'll send it to you. And they look at the 3 C's: career, community, and cause. And they look at which of those factors is important to these Facebook employees. Most companies focus on one of them. They generally look at career, or they look at community. They don't really look at all 3. What we're seeing, the study finds, is that actually when you get companies who are focused on all 3, you get higher retention, you get more happy employees. The career focus is very much about autonomy, strength, which creates motivation. The community limb of the drivers is about feeling respected, recognized, and having a sense of belonging with the organization you're working in. And the cause element of this focuses on purpose, meaningful impact, and mission. Do you have a sense of pride in the organization and the work that you're doing? What the Harvard Business Review calls this, they call it the psychological contract between your employees and the organization. Generally, businesses have been designed on the basis of the physical contract and your output, and not really the psychological contract, which is pretty key. So what are the risks in terms of managing the Great Resignation? Well, I mean, not being able to get your business objectives met because you are short-staffed, short-handed, the supply chain issues manifest if you can't actually get your output working. And that is going to be a big lag into 2022. I don't think we're going to feel the true impact of this year. It's definitely going to run it through 2022. So what do you do to help manage that risk? Well, you've got to keep your people, you've got to keep your best people, and you've got to attract some good people. So for your existing staff, preventing burnout, as I've mentioned before, is a pretty key one. Look at your boundaries. How do you encourage people to take that time off? Do you look at something akin to the French model? Some of you will remember the right to switch off, which means organizations leave people alone after work hours, discourage people from emails at night and over the weekends, or just get clever with if you are sending emails as managers, making clear on the title, this is not for action over the weekend, deal with it next week, whatever that may be. Some of that removes some of the mental pressure on employees, particularly if they are working from home and juggling sort of family and other commitments. Again, looking at asynchronistic working, can you allow employees the flexibility about when they complete their tasks? That gives you an ability to give them some accountability and autonomy that does not severely impact your business, as long as the output is there and measurable. Again, don't force your employees to be on Zoom every day. Allow them time to have their cameras off. There was a time when a phone call was just a phone call, and we need to remember that is possible. We do have great technology, but sometimes we don't always need it. Using alternative work models, there is an element to which we can now look at more advanced models of outsourcing and crowdsourcing to help give you a pool of resources that will allow you to supplement your workforce when you do have crunch points in your year, if you needed to give, for example, people extended time off due to ill health or family commitments. So make that work for you, and actually organizations who demonstrate the ability to think creatively around support systems for their existing workforce, it makes the workforce feel included in terms of how workflow is going to be managed going forward. Get creative about retention and availability. I'll come on to talk about some of those, and think about compliance and regulation with new models of work. Finding a balance between protecting the organization and not ramming it down people's throats is really difficult. There are ways, again, if you get employees to buy into the security standards and compliance standards that you're trying to put in place, but don't make them so onerous that it effectively removes their ability to work on a hybrid or remote basis. That balance is really, really important. So what's coming next? Rahul, if you do poll 2, this is actually going to be the answer to the original question. So do you want to put that one up quickly? So again, if you could pick your top 3. Yeah. Okay. So the first answer is the same as the European and US polls, and the rest actually quite interestingly differ. So the availability of workers being a lower concern, that you'd expect that in Asia, because I don't think we've seen that crunch in terms of labour supply and the supply chain just yet. As I said, my view is that it is coming. Interesting that health and safety is further up the chain for Asia. Whether that is because we have, off the back of SARS and now COVID, we have a slightly different social compact around managing the pandemic. I suspect that we maybe have a slightly more cautious approach to the health and safety aspects, certainly when it's COVID related. But maybe, Paul, you can give us your thoughts in your session. Managing productivity, I love the fact that's come up high up. Asia is tough in terms of productivity. We expect high standards, we expect high output, and that's something that's quite interesting. And no one is worried about labour. Oh no, that's trade unions is at the bottom there. That is also quite interesting. So what do we think, Rahul? I think we can close that one. So what do we think is coming up? So we touched on digitalisation, technology and automation. Those are particularly going to be relevant for the supply chain, but they are relevant to all other businesses. We're seeing a lot of people moving things like benefits and wellness programs online, using technology to help employees track their experience at work in a real-time manner, but also making sure that technology facilitates ease. If you've got employees who are filling in paper expenses forms to get expenses payments, if they're having to fill in, long laborious forms to get medical reimbursements, all of that there's a technology solution for all of that. If you need timesheets and time and hours recording, that can be digitalized. There's technology available that will just free up time in the day that employees don't need to worry about. We are going to see a move away from some Zoom. I think there's a move towards avatars in some places, so you have less stress in terms of the visual cues of being on a conference call, but you have a little avatar that is still moving and reflecting what you think, which is quite nice. I do think we're going to have to look at new types of benefits for employees, because it's become very clear to everyone that they have new stresses in their lives, or stresses that were there but they now actually want to take care of during their sort of working career. And I think they're going to look towards employers to respect those. Some of that is adding other members of the family to their some private medical insurance, things like that. Does it just have to be a spouse and kids, or could it be an elder care? Can it be a brother and sister who's not well, for example? Thinking outside the box in terms of that stuff. Transport is quite a big one for people who maybe have moved their life goals and will be coming in and out of office spaces in a different way. A lot of companies are now looking at transport allowances and stipends for that type of work. I mentioned heating bills and childcare costs earlier. I'm going to put pet care in there because that's my concern. With remote workers, a lot of people went out and got pets, and now if they're being asked to go back to the office, there's quite a lot of concern about how they're going to spend time with those animals. In Europe, a lot of people are looking at pet-friendly offices and ways to juggle that, but also, just building into the concept that people might want to spend time with something that's not a child or their spouse, and actually that's okay. So being a bit broad-minded about some of that stuff. Allowing people the flexibility to come and go at the office to avoid extra cost. A lot of people with young children will know that your childcare costs go up if you have to do outside of school childcare. If you have the ability to get home and pick up your kid and then log on again at home, then that will be something that an employer can help you with in terms of allowing cost saving there. I do think one of the things that people have talked a lot about is when people move out of the city to work, should we rebalance salaries to bring them down to a lower level? Some companies talked about that and started looking at it, but actually I think the war on talent, certainly in the US and EMEA, has put paid to that to a degree. If that levels out, I can foresee a situation where we have higher COLA allowances, so cost of living allowances for those people who do choose to live in the cities, and where businesses think that is something that is essential. I think we need to think about the fact that the employee assistance programs that we used to have as organizations are no longer really fit for purpose. We need those to be broader. They should be looking at the full range of employee experience and stresses, financial, home planning, alcoholism, relationship counsel, whatever that may be. We need to sort of think broader about that. One thing I want to talk about quickly is just extension of carer regimes. Certainly one of the big discussions is about elder care and protection for people who have that elder care responsibility, not just disabled care or childcare, and I can foresee that coming down the pike quite quickly. So I know I'm running out of time. I need to give Paul his slot, so I will move on with some of this. I just wanted to flag this one to you. You can read this in your own time, but when we're looking at reskilling and upskilling and sort of retaining talent and the ability to move people, not lose them in the organization, but potentially move them to new roles where you've had a reduction in demand in one area and increase in another. Singapore, interestingly, has always had skills directives or that people can work to, but recently they've updated a critical core skills, and this is very, very much more what they call the human domain. It's the soft skills area which they are encouraging their workforce to move towards and sort of bring into their skill base. So very, very interesting that actually Singapore has come out and given you a list of soft skills that you should be working towards, that should be additive to an increase in automation and digital transformation in workplaces, and allow you to work alongside technology and not take away from it. So in terms of leadership, again, fluidity and flexibility. How do you move from our traditional workforce planning and sort of business models, the hierarchical pyramid approach, and how do you move it to an organization which is much flatter, where you have fluidity and flexibility, and the ability to move talent around. Back in the day, there used to be this concept of sort of you used to have sort of management programs where individuals could move from department to department and get sort of experience, and they were sort of quite generic skills-based employees. I can foresee that you might have subgroups of that type of program within your organization. They may have a specialist program and a sort of a generalist program that allows you to move people around. It means you have less risk in terms of flight risk within particular departments, and it allows for greater cross-pollination of ideas and sort of I guess skills development within the wider organization. So I think that's one thing that people need to think about as an option going forward. So challenges in the future world of work, I'm going to pick a couple of these. In terms of D&I, the reason for putting that on there is I think there's going to be a higher requirement in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of companies being accountable for their statistics in a much more measured way. So in Europe and US, you have, very, very strong D&I reporting requirements that will come to Asia in due course. It's already coming in through the stock exchanges, but it will become a part and parcel of our DNA. And we are going to be required to do it in a way that we would in terms of presenting customer data. We're going to have to do this analysis with the same type of rigor. We also need to look at workplace engagement in a way that isn't just an annual engagement survey. They don't work. We need smart measurement. We need regular measurement. You need pulse surveys. You need clever ways to take the temperature of your organization and make sure that as you're pivoting policies, that is working for you. I want to flag also the speak out culture. So making sure that you have psychological safety within your organization. People trust their colleagues and their organization enough to speak up when they think something is wrong, or when they want to share an idea and in a way that they're not going to get shut down and humiliated for doing that. That's going to be really critical. Again, it comes back to that generational approach of autonomy and engagement and empowerment. People want to be able to share their views, and they want to do it in a way that isn't going to get shot down. I want to pick quickly on the discrimination risk in the last column there. With the remote working from home approach, hybrid working, there is a slight lag in some of that. That there will be people who choose to do that where organizations allow. It's really important that those people have an equitable approach or treated equitably by the organization, so they're not forgotten just because they're not in the office. That does have the risk, in my view, of leading to some sort of indirect discrimination type situation. The other area I want people to think about is algorithms and AI, particularly where you're looking at recruitment. Some of the algorithms and AI we know is being challenged on the basis that it's inherently discriminatory. So when you're looking at your future transformation and getting your talent through the door, I think you should be unpicking how you are doing that. Are your job descriptions targeted at one group? Are your filters on your electronic applications via LinkedIn, for example, are they only giving you one type of candidate? If so, you may have an inherently discriminatory piece of algorithm running, and that's definitely something that we all need to look at. So how should you be a future ready manager? Well, I think what we know now is that HR and talent are critical functions. They are no longer just a support function, and they never were in my world. But optically, and sometimes in the business, they get forgotten. A lot of our HR clients have pretty much died over the last 2 years with the volume of work that's been put on them in terms of managing workforce and COVID and the rest of that. Give them a pat on the back and sort of make sure that they are your friends, because they will be going forward. Think about how you connect to talent, and again, stop missing talent. A lot of job applications, CV standards, they're just based on the same thing. Do you need someone with a degree to do this job? Many companies, that's just the assumption because someone has told the recruiters that needs to happen. Well, ask the managers, do you need someone with a degree for this job, or does someone with 10 years experience in the market fit that bill as well? Don't just filter them out because they don't meet one criteria. Make sure that you've got an ability to look at a wider subset of the job market as well. Again, I mentioned sort of upskilling and reskilling, looking at people's skills generally and seeing whether they can be moved into different areas of the business as you need. As one business area is in a bit of a slowdown, let's move people across. If they've got the right skill set, give them some ramp up time and see if they can succeed in another area of the business. It means you haven't lost, you haven't had to hire again, and you don't have retention issues. Obviously, there is going to be a refinement of policies. Sorry, go back post-pandemic, but policies. I'm a big fan of not over-policying. So retaining some flexibility, as well as not being inconsistent with how you treat people and creating a two-tier workforce is quite important. I think it's really important to drop the one-size-fits-all model. It just doesn't work in this day and age. That sort of old school hierarchical model is no longer effective. As I put the reminder there, look at your career community cause elements and try and get your organization set up for a collective success where your teams are built to succeed, and not necessarily just looking at the hierarchical pyramid. Right, I'm going to move on to Paul to finish up on health and safety.
Thanks, Julia. And hello, everyone. And I'll try and keep this fairly brief for you. I'm not going to go through every element in every slide. I'll just talk to the presentation generally. And I'm really going to be talking about occupational health and safety at a general level, looking at it really from a global perspective. We obviously need to think about all the various nuances in Hong Kong and China and other jurisdictions. But as Julia's pointed out, I mean, that's really a lot to digest when you think about the speed of change. And it's almost like COVID's been an accelerant to things like hybrid work. And it's interesting. I mean, remote working, everyone says, well, we're remote working because of COVID, but we've forgotten actually it's a substitution control from a health and safety perspective from exposing people to the risk. That's why we're working from home. And so it's actually a health and safety control that's triggered why we're doing that. But what seemed to have happened is we've had this accelerant, we've moved very quickly, and we're really trying to catch up and really trying to uncouple what's going on and trying to deal with it. And in many respects, thinking of the future creates a high degree of anxiety in itself. What will it mean? How will we cope? What will we do? And from that perspective, I think it's important to look for the future. It's important to plan for the future. It's important to have in place appropriate health and safety controls for the future. But really, the way you get to the future is also in the present moment and making sure that the plans that you are thinking about, you're executing, and then you're making determinations as to whether or not those strategies or plans that you're implementing actually are working. And if they're working, you persevere with them. And if they don't, you pivot. But in many respects, there's a lot of thinking ahead, but really you've got to deal with a lot of issues in the present moment and deal with them well. Otherwise, they will have a negative knock-on effect in the future. And a lot of those issues were the issues Julia was talking about. I mean, if you're not thinking about, for example, your employee wellbeing right now. So, Julia, if you can just move to that slide, the wellbeing slide for me. If you're not thinking about employee wellbeing, there's immediate impacts and benefits in terms of employee wellbeing. Sorry, Julie, it's the slide before that, just the results of the survey. Thank you. There's some really immediate benefits that are coming through when you're looking at employee wellbeing. And you can wait, you can think about it, you can plan, or you can start implementing these initiatives now. And your employees aren't waiting for plans, they're wanting to see action. And my view in many of these initiatives, you don't have to set yourself in stone and make major commitments. Employees are used to dynamic processes and they're happy to work with dynamic processes if it delivers some benefits. And so it may be, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do well thought out things, but I'm also suggesting there's no point overthinking things to the point of paralysis and inertia that nothing actually gets done. And so really you can see as the results of this survey, there's some real benefits of driving some employee wellbeing programs, and it's about getting chips in the bank now rather than trying to get the bank all in one go in 2 years' time. You might have it, but you might not have any customers. So very, very important that I think you think about driving initiatives now that make impacts now, and even if they're not going to achieve everything, anything that gives you some velocity towards employee wellbeing and wellness is going to put you on the path towards where you want to be in terms of workplace health and safety and those broader, more important retention and engagement issues as well. Just the next slide. Thanks, Julia. One of the other challenges you have is really around how that's done. And when we're talking about health and safety generally, I think you've got to bring a set of principles to what you want to do. I mean, you try to often steer organisations at a global level, and I think that can be done. I think if you can produce a product or a service that a client feels the same way about which country they're in, there's an opportunity to do that in terms of the employee experience or the contractor experience. So to some extent, I think a business can set some guiding principles, and they're often very strong and inspirational statements from the very senior leaders of the business setting out what their aspiration and goal is, and that can be set around health and safety and wellbeing, which effectively provides the governing principle, helps clear the fog. So often you have a scenario where there's some fog about or some grey about what you should do, and it provides clarity in decision-making. You overlay that guiding principle and say, well, that's the guiding principle. I mean, often a lot of clients say to me, well, how should we interpret this particular law or this particular direction in relation to COVID or a health and safety issue? And really, you interpret, as we all know as lawyers, you don't generally interpret something restrictively when it's about improving the health and safety of others. If there's something that's on the line, you're generally going to interpret it more in favour and what's going to bring about a safer workplace, not one that's going to bring about a less safer workplace. And guiding principles provide that sort of aid to decision-making, drives culture and climate, sets the tone. And then you've got to have some standards that help bring some framework to that, to those principles, that give some structure, that give some encouragement and also discouragement of the wrong behaviours. And in many respects, minimum standards do that. They help you apply minimum expectations across your global operations. They help manage cross-border risk management issues. It also important to recognise that a lot of them will operate in a scenario where you've still got to compare the requirement of the global standard and what happens in the local jurisdiction and deliver, which generally provides the more optimal health and safety outcome. And you can use those to engage with third-party arrangements, overlay your standards to parties you engage with, and also a basis for assurance that can feed into your governance. And then obviously good things happen to good organisations, but bad things happen to good organisations, and bad things happen to good leaders as well. Just like most certainly bad things happen to bad leaders. And effectively, on the basis that bad things can happen to good leaders and good companies, you've got to have a response plan. You do have to think about the unthinkable sometimes and say, even though we've got these guiding principles and these minimum standards, we know everything doesn't go to plan, so we've got to have a plan to respond to it. And so making sure you've got that in place, that you test and practice it, and you make sure also that it complies with local legal requirements. And what we're seeing now is you'd often see workplace disasters historically around structures and explosions and things like that. Well, we're starting to have response plans for, sadly, mental health issues, employee suicides, cluster suicides. So we're having to think about things very, very differently. And it's very, very important that we set the tone for what our expectations are in this space. Next slide. Thanks, Julia. So I'm just mindful of the time. And so in terms of those issues, I don't want to get too bogged down, but we've talked about the standards and laws, etc. I mean, there's the remote working side of things and thinking about those key issues around remote work, risk assessments, thinking about building structures, ventilation, how we can have better hygiene controls. We've talked about incident response, building in emergency planning, and our hybrid working arrangement almost helps position us for future pandemics. Next slide, thanks, or variations of the current. What are we looking at in terms of the future? Well, this physical, emotional, mental, interpersonal, whole gambit of the self and the worker and the employees becoming a major issue. It's a very, very people-centred issue. It's not about the risk, the physical risk we're exposing people to now, but the psychological risk. Julia talked about the Zoom burnout, the high risks of mental health leading from both suicidal ideations to suicide. There's the whole aspects of COVID-19 and just whole areas of issues around future pandemics and also variations of the current. And even looking around how AI interferes with health and safety, even in the physical sense around just robots. I've had robotic incidents involving robots where workers would be seriously injured, and if a human was working, it would have stopped continuing to injure the worker, but because the robot doesn't know what's occurring, continued to injure the worker. So it's understanding what those new dimensions mean in terms of introduction of new risks into the workplace. Next slide. Thanks, Julia. And so my final just issue about what I'd like to say is that I've tried to keep it quick, but it really is about thinking about the future, but giving great consideration to present initiatives, present control effectiveness, and persevering with what's working well and what isn't. You need to adapt very quickly in the current risk environment. So I think I'll stop there because I'm very mindful of the time.
Right. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you very much, Julia. We actually have run out of time, but I think if you can just answer one question very, very briefly, the question would be, how do you manage claims for safety accidents when people are working at home or in a cafe or perhaps a co-working space in these times? Very briefly, thank you.
Sure. Julia, do you want me to?
I think you should do that one.
Yeah, sure. So look, the main issue for that is about setting the expectation of what working from home actually means and having in place appropriate working from home processes and procedures, having people informed, trained, and a degree of checking that people are complying with the working from home arrangements is the key aspect. Because if there's no framework for or process for your expectation about how they will work from home, whether they can work from a cafe, etc., there's no measure for which you can appropriately respond and deal with those claims, because where there is, unfortunately, that grey area, that's where the law plays in. You've got to really try and bring some structure and process to that arrangement.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm sure the attendees today have more questions for Julia and Paul. I've shared their contact information in the chat window. If you have any questions, please do get in touch with them directly. If you need a copy of their slides, do the same. And with that, thank you very much, Paul and Julia. Again, if you would like to now close your webcams and put yourself on mute, there's a quick update on the post-event survey and the in-house community. Thank you so much.